Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we talk about a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is February 14th. Today is a day that most people associate with love and romance, but for true crime fans, February 14th has a much darker meaning. On this day in 1929, 7 men were gunned down in a Chicago garage in what became one of the most infamous gangland killings in American history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This brutal execution wasn't just another mob hit. It exposed the true depths of organized crime during the Prohibition era and helped seal the fate of one of America's most infamous gangsters, Al Capone. Today, we're going to take a closer look at what led to this massacre, who was behind it, and how it changed the fight against organized crime. Let's get started. To really understand what went down on that bloody Valentine's Day, we need to talk about Chicago in the 1920s. This was the height of Prohibition, a time when alcohol was illegal, but also a time which, let's be real, people were still drinking. So instead of breeding a nation of teetotalers, the laws created a massive underground economy controlled by gangsters. And these gangsters made a fortune bootlegging alcohol. And as we've seen time and time again, where there's money, there's violence. Two of the biggest players in Chicago's criminal underworld were Al Capone and George Bugs Moran. Al Capone was the head of the South Side Italian gang, and he built his empire through bootlegging, gambling, and extortion. George Bugs Moran was the leader of the North Side Irish gang, and he was one of Capone's fiercest rivals. These two hated each other, and for good reason. They had both tried to kill each other multiple times, like over the course of years. By 1929, their feud had turned Chicago streets into a war zone. Several of Moran's men had been gunned down by Capone's crew, and Moran himself had barely survived multiple assassination attempts. This tension set the stage for one of the most infamous crimes in American history. February 14th, 1929 was a frigid Thursday morning in Chicago. At around 10:30 a.m., 7 men associated with Moran's North Side gang gathered inside the SMC Cartage Company garage at 2122 North Clark Street. They were waiting for a shipment of bootlegged whiskey, or so they thought. Among them were Albert Kachelic, aka James Clark, who was Moran's right-hand man, Frank and Peter Gusenberg, known gang enforcers, Adam Hayer, the gang's bookkeeper, Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist who liked the gangster lifestyle a bit too much, Albert Weinshank, a businessman who looked a lot like Bugs Moran, and John May, a mechanic who worked for the gang. Then, while these men were waiting, 4 men walked into the garage. 2 of them were dressed as police officers. The other 2 were in plain clothes. The gangsters assumed that this was just a routine raid, and back then it wasn't unusual for cops to shake down bootleggers. So when the officers lined them up against the wall, they complied. But then the gunfire started. The intruders pulled out Thompson's submachine guns and a shotgun and unleashed over 70 rounds into the men who were just standing there defenseless. By the time it was over, 6 were dead on the floor, and 1, Frank Gusenberg, was barely hanging on. When the real police arrived, Frank was riddled with bullets but still clinging to life. The police asked him, "Who shot you?" His reply, "Nobody shot me." Even in his final moments, he stuck to the gangster code of silence, and a million Hollywood gangster movies were born. But here's the thing. The real target that day wasn't these 7 men, it was Bugs Moran himself. But Moran wasn't in the garage where he was supposed to be. He had overslept and was actually at a coffee shop nearby when he saw what he thought was a police raid happening down the street. But he sensed that something was a little off about it, so he quietly slipped away, narrowly avoiding his own death. When he later found out what had happened, he immediately blamed Capone and called him a coward for ordering the attack. The massacre made national headlines. For the first time, everyday Americans saw just how brutal the world of organized crime really was. Photos of the blood-soaked crime scene were plastered across newspapers, showing the sheer carnage that was left behind, and people were horrified. For years, gangsters like Al Capone had been glorified in the media. They were seen as charming outlaws who played by their own rules. But after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, that illusion was shattered. The investigation was one of the most intense in Chicago's history. Ballistics linked the bullets to other gangland killings, which suggested that Capone's South Side gang was in fact responsible. Capone himself had an alibi, of course. He was conveniently in Florida at the time of the killings. Despite the evidence that pointed to Capone's gang, no one was ever convicted for the massacre. So why was that? Well, there are a couple things going on. Remember, the shooters wore those police uniforms, which kind of made a lot of eyewitness testimony useless. And the gangsters refused to talk. I mean, even the survivor at the very end. Even in his last words, he wasn't saying nothing. But beyond that, police corruption likely also played a role in covering up key evidence. You remember when we talked about the whole beginning of the massacre? The 7 men just thought it was a shakedown because that's what Chicago police were doing at the time. So it stands to reason that a few of them were probably on the payroll and weren't really working very hard to get this case moving to where it would need to be. Their best lead ended up coming a few months after the massacre when police arrested Fred Killer Burke, a known Capone hitman. During a search of his Michigan home, authorities found 2 Thompson submachine guns, the very weapons used in the massacre. But Burke was never charged with the killings because they already had him on a bunch of other crimes, and so they just kept him in jail for that. To this day, nearly 100 years after this massacre, the true identities of the gunmen remain unknown. If Capone thought this massacre would solidify his power, he was dead wrong. The public backlash was immense, and it put a massive target on his back. President Herbert Hoover personally ordered federal agencies to take Capone down. But rather than getting him for murder, they famously went after his finances. In 1931, Capone was convicted of tax evasion and was sentenced to 11 years in prison. The massacre that was supposed to eliminate his biggest rival ended up destroying his empire instead. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre remains one of America's most infamous unsolved crimes. Though we all pretty much know that Capone was behind it, no one was ever officially charged. And while his downfall was inevitable, this massacre sped up the process, leading to one of the biggest federal crackdowns on organized crime. Though the crackdown did certainly change the face of organized crime, a new wave quickly emerged to take its place, leading to many more decades of crimes and crime fighting, and of course, all of those gangster movies. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this episode compelling, please subscribe, rate, review, and watch us on your favorite podcasting platform. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!